In my last lecture, I explained why there's such a thing as the good, in the final sense of good, and I'm going to start by reviewing that account. There are final goods because there are in the world certain entities, agents, that take care of their own well-functioning. In fact, their well-functioning is almost constituted by their taking care of their own well-functioning, because what these entities most essentially are is almost given by the various possible modes of taking care of yourself. There is, for instance, a giraffe way of taking care of yourself, and what it is to be a giraffe is to engage in the giraffe way of taking care of yourself. And there's a porcupine way of taking care of yourself, and what it is to be a porcupine is to engage in the porcupine way of taking care of yourself. There's such a thing as the good, in other words, because there are entities that engage in self-constitution. The way that the existence of these entities gives rise to the final good is this. The way that they take care of themselves is by finding the things that promote their own well-functioning attractive, which helps them to pursue them, and finding the things that interfere with their own well-functioning aversive, which helps them to avoid them. If nature had a point of view of her own, we might say that when she did this, she made a terrible error, for she created entities that have a point of view from which they can criticize nature herself. But nature has no point of view and doesn't care about this or anything else. All the caring and all the valuing in the world emanates from the point of view of her creatures, and so therefore does the final good. Now, I said just now that the well-functioning of these entities is almost constituted by their modes of taking care of themselves, because in fact nature has designed these entities, if I may put it that way, to do two other jobs. It has designed them to ensure the continued existence of certain genetic materials, and in the service of that end, it has designed them to reproduce. There's a difference between these two ends, however. For most animals, reproduction, like survival, is a good from their own point of view, at least in the sense that they willingly engage in the activities that promote it, and indeed don't willingly forgo them. In many animals, there's also an active desire for offspring, and a willingness to suffer and possibly even risk death to ensure their survival. But the well-functioning of the genetic materials may require the animal to do things that do not appear as attractive from the point of view of the animal herself, such as getting old and dying. Now, let me put this point in a context which will explain why I mention it. Aristotle, as we've seen, believed that the function of an organism is to survive and reproduce. Organisms have self-maintaining forms, as he thought of it. When an organism dies, Aristotle supposed, this is not because of its form, but because of its matter. There are flaws or weaknesses in the matter. He was not precisely right about this according to modern science, since according to many modern scientists, many animals are in various ways programmed to die. So to put this point in Aristotelian terms, we might say that they have death written into their forms, rather than just being something to which they're subject because of their matter. However, the reason animals are programmed to die is that the genetic materials which they carry are more likely to survive if there's sufficient variation in their hosts to ensure that some of them will survive changing conditions. But of course, that's only necessary because of the impossibility of building an organism that can survive any possible changes that might befall it. That is to say, it's only necessary because even a creature that's not programmed to die may die because of the properties of its matter. It may get squashed by a meteor and burn up in a fire, or fall into a deep hole where there's nothing to eat. In other words, it's only because of the general possibility of death that for the genetic materials, the ever-changing nature, and so the deaths of the specific forms that host them, can be an advantage. In this larger sense, Aristotle was right. The problem lies with matter. Matter cannot take on any guaranteed permanent forms, or anyway, any guaranteed permanent forms large and complex enough to be alive. Death, therefore, is not a good for an organism, or at least it's not a good for an organism merely because of the way it may be written into an organism's genetic program or form. To be good for an organism, death, or the things that bring it about, would have to find its way into the organism's own point of view as something attractive. Death is not like nourishment or reproduction. The way that death is written into our forms does not require that we act so as to bring it about. Now, when I say that for death to be good, the things that bring death about would have to seem attractive to the organism, of course I mean they would have to seem attractive to the organism even if the organism were itself well-functioning. I have to add that rider, even though it threatens to introduce some circularity into my account, because of course many things that lead to death seem attractive to an organism that's poorly functioning. The addict longs for heroin or nicotine or alcohol, for instance. We don't want to say, and need not say, that everything that seems worth pursuing to an organism is part of its good. But adding this rider may give rise to a problem. The problem is this. The cases I just mentioned of addiction and things like it are cases in which someone is poorly functioning because he's developed a bad habit, or perhaps because one's been forced upon him by the conditions in which he lives. But I also want to say that we can be poorly functioning through no individual mischance if we live in vastly different circumstances than the ones we involved in. To take a very well-known example, human beings living in conditions of plenty may still have an urge to stock up on fatty foods whenever we can, as if we were anticipating the famine that never comes. But of course you may argue that I only want to say that counts as poorly functioning because it leads to death. And right now I'm in the middle of an argument that's supposed to show that death is not good just because of the ways it may be built into our form or program. Clearly you might think I'm not allowed to assume death is bad in the middle of an argument intended to show that death is not necessarily good, even for creatures who have it built into their programs. Now, one way to avoid this problem would be by tightening up the criteria that determine what counts as something's being attractive from a creature's own point of view. For instance, if I said death was bad only for creatures who can think about death, I could argue that the longing for fatty foods counts as ill functioning on these grounds. As soon as we who can think about death realize that fatty foods can lead to premature death, we will at least wish that we could stop finding them attractive. That would perhaps show that they're aversive in the required way from the human point of view. But it would leave us without a way to show that death is bad for an animal that can't think about death. The trouble is, that seems to me to be plainly false, despite what many inhumane people try to tell themselves. Death is bad for any animal in the sense that in most cases, it is the loss of everything that's good for her. But that remark is just the tip of an iceberg. For here we arrive at an important asymmetry between the good and the bad. The asymmetry is that in a certain way, good is a positive thing and bad is a privative one. Although it's taken me this long to get around to mentioning it, I don't wish to drop this traditional notion completely from my account. But I don't mean to suggest that merely because bad is a privative notion, the bare absence of good is itself bad. In fact, I'm committed to denying that, because I think that unless there is someone for the good to be good for, its absence is nothing. The point I have in mind is more complicated than that. There's an ancient debate about the relation between the good and bad and reality. Are good and evil two equally real forces on a footing with each other, locked in an eternal struggle for control of the world, as the Manichaeans believed? Or is evil somehow merely the absence of good, something essentially privative or defective, a lack, in the way that darkness, although it seems substantial enough to those who fear it, is really the absence of light? Is there a malicious force at work in the universe, or merely a tendency for the goodness of things to decay if it's not actively maintained? The question puzzles us, I believe, because the answer is different for the two different kinds of good that I distinguished last time. When we think of functional good, it seems clear that badness is a privative. Ill-functioning is simply the absence of well-functioning, nothing more. An ill-functioning thing is one that's in danger of losing its form, falling apart. It's on its way to unreality. A bad thing, functionally speaking, is one that threatens to undermine well-functioning, either from within, like an illness, or from without, like the meteor that squashes you flat. But from the point of view of creatures who take care of themselves, who look after their own well-functioning, The aversive and the attractive are on a footing, so the bad seems just as real as the good. Pain, to take an obvious example, seems just at least as substantial as pleasure. Perhaps even more so, for many philosophers have claimed, although I don't myself think this is quite true, that being in pain is something about which you can make no mistake. Well, that doesn't seem so obvious about pleasure. So the condition that our conscious states, in a sense, represent to us when we deem something bad is a kind of looming unreality. But the representation itself is substantial enough. In that sense, it's exactly like the dark. Although the dark is simply the absence of visible properties, in a sense it represents that absence to us because the dark is something that we can see. What does all that have to do with the badness of death? Well, it shows that badness and death in a certain way are nearly identical. Badness as we experience it is the representation of oncoming chaos and formlessness and entropy. And so of death, the death of all things individual, all things for whom anything can be good or bad. Pufendorf, in the quotation I have chosen as the motto for these lectures, mentions a view widely held before the modern period, that the real and the good are the same. As he puts it, that every entity actually existing may be considered good. Pufendorf himself rejects this view in favor of the view that I'm advocating in these lectures, that everything that's good must be good for someone. In one way, the Aristotelian metaphysical story I told in the last lecture supports the traditional claim that every real thing is good. For on Aristotle's picture, a thing's reality and its well-functioning do coincide. An ill-functioning thing is a thing that's falling apart, and so losing its reality. But Pufendorf is still right, because this is not, at least according to the arguments I've given, bad absolutely, but bad for the thing in question. So it's not true that every actual thing is an absolute good. But what is true, I think, is that for living things, their own existence is, unless life gets very bad indeed, a final good. For a thing's well-functioning just is its life, and its well-functioning is also its good. This shows that I can, after all, assume that death is bad in the middle of an argument intended to show that even if it's written into our programs, we need not conclude that it's part of our good. For because badness is the privation not only of good, but of the creature for whom anything can be good, badness is for that creature the deprivation of all that's good. All of this gives us another way of thinking about valence. I've been characterizing positive and negative valence in terms of action, where positive valence is a kind of going forwards or trying to realize, and negative valence is a kind of going away from or trying to avert. Going away from or trying to avert what? The answer might be reality, in particular your own reality, your life. Life and death are what set the two poles of valence. In that sense, life is value itself. Now, although it may seem odd, I don't take this argument to settle the question whether or not death might be good for us. I only take it to settle the question whether we have to say that death is good for us just because of the ways in which it might be written into our programs. The question whether death is good for us also depends on a different issue, namely whether there is essentially something finite or limited about the good, and perhaps in particular the human good. This obviously depends on what the good turns out to be for a given sort of creature. It could be that human good has to take a certain definite sort of shape that is incompatible with immortality. Let me give you an example of the sort of argument I have in mind. Jeff McMahon has argued that death is worse for a human being than for another kind of animal because human life has a sort of narrative structure. Here's what he says. This is a long quote. It's on the handout. The lives of persons typically have a narrative structure that may demand completion in a certain way. People autonomously establish purposes for their lives, form patterns of structured relations with others, and thereby create expectations and dependencies that require fulfillment. The importance of later events in a typical human life may thus be greatly magnified by their relation to ambitions formed and activities engaged in earlier. The goods of a person's expected future life may assume a special significance within the life as a whole if they would bring long-standing projects to fruition, extend previous achievements, resolve conflicts, harmonize hitherto dissonant ambitions, redeem past mistakes, or in general round out or complete the narrative structures established earlier. In the lives of animals, however, this potential for complex narrative unity is entirely absent. There are no projects that require completion, mistakes that demand rectification, or personal relations that promise to ripen or mature. Rather, as Aldous Huxley once put it, the dumb creation lives a life made up of discrete and mutually irrelevant episodes. Each day is merely more of the same. But of course, the reflection that human life has a narrative structure could lead us to the opposite conclusion. For a narrative structure requires a beginning, a middle, and an end. McMahon says it himself. Things that are narratively structured demand completion. Of course, we would need much more to make this argument. We would need to know why human good depends on having a life with a narrative structure and why a narrative structure requires completion. I'll say something more about these matters later on. But if something like this is true only of human life, as McMahon supposes, then it would be possible that death is good for us, or anyway necessary to our good, in a way that it's not for the other animals. Because we can also turn the other part of McMahon's argument upside down. It might seem, for instance, as if a non-human female animal could find such joy as she's capable of in raising a litter of cubs every year for all eternity, even though most of them are doomed to be forgotten and die. Now, I'll have to leave this interesting issue aside here. I've argued that although good is not, as the traditional doctrine holds, identical to reality, something close to it is true. Their own reality is necessarily good in the eyes of living beings themselves, for on their own reality all that's good for them depends. Since you can only remain alive to the extent that you're well-functioning, life is necessarily good for the conscious agent who lives it, unless it is accidentally bad. This puts me in a position to address a larger concern that you may have about circularity. I'm claiming that the final good comes into the world with agents who take their own functional good and the things that promote it as a final good. You might worry that means I'm not, after all, explaining the origin of the good, for I'm taking the notion of well-functioning for granted, and that's a notion with valence already built into it, a normative or at least an evaluative notion already. But actually, we can now see we need only say that their own well-functioning is a good in the eyes of the living things themselves. We don't need to appeal to any already existing goods and evils in order to explain the good. We need only appeal to the existence of loosely homeostatic systems whose functioning involves conscious agency directed by attractive and aversive reactions. I'm not explaining the final good by appeal to the functional good. Rather, I'm explaining final good by appeal to a certain kind of functioning, a certain kind of thing that happens, to the fact there are creatures who function in a certain way. Or rather, since function itself can be a kind of success word, I'm explaining final good in terms of a certain kind of homeostatic system. Now, let me return momentarily to the problem from which I started in my first lecture in order to make this point a little more clearly. I complained that final good cannot be a form of evaluative good because evaluative good itself is a kind of well-functioning, and life and ends are not the sorts of things that have functions. You might suppose that in appealing to Aristotle's theory that the function of organic life is to take care of itself, I have admitted that life, after all, does have a function and said that our good rests in fulfilling it. But I haven't. Instead, I've explained final good as a kind of perception of well-functioning and the things that promote it. But even that's saying too much, for it's only from the point of view of the creature itself that the perception is something valenced. The perception is really just the perception that a certain kind of functioning, neutrally describable as homeostatic functioning through perception-directed action, is going on. Once that gives us the notion of the final good, we can explain evaluative good and every other form of good in terms of final good. Evaluative good is, in a very broad sense, instrumental good. It rests in the properties of things that enable them to promote our final ends. Now, those claims obviously need much more defense. That the evaluative good of tools and instruments themselves as a form of instrumental good is pretty much tautologous. It's good for the knife to be sharp because knives are used to cut things. It's much more controversial to claim that something like aesthetic value derives from the contribution that it makes to the final good of the one who enjoys it. In this case, people are tempted to think it must go the other way. They think that the evaluative goodness of a work of art explains the fact that it can contribute to the final good of the one who enjoys it. My view commits me to the view that things are beautiful because of the effects they have on us, rather than the reverse. Obviously, I can't go into these complex matters right now. But for now, it's enough to show that my explanation of why there's such a thing as the final good does not illicitly presuppose the notion of functional or evaluative good. It only presupposes that there are creatures whose mode of homeostatic functioning involves perception-directed action. Okay, now I'm ready to address the question which I promised to discuss in this lecture. What sorts of entities have a good? By which, of course, I mean a final good. In much of what I've just said, I've assumed what I take to be the most obvious case, the case of animals. Animals are the obvious case because animals are conscious living beings who function by acting and who experience attractive and aversive reactions that determine which ends they go for as part of that way of functioning. But there are other cases that are worth some separate consideration. The cases of plants, machines, the environment, species, pets, genetically modified animals, and people. I'm going to talk about some of these today, not all of them. Exploring them will also put us in a position to say something a little more nuanced about animals. But before I begin to investigate these issues, I want to remind you of an important point. I haven't yet said anything about morality, and in particular, I haven't as yet said anything about when and whether the final good matters morally. I will be saying more about that shortly and addressing the topic more directly tomorrow. But I wanted to mention this because I think sometimes people get confused between their intuitions about which things have a final good that matters morally and their intuitions about which things can be said to have a final good at all. Now, whenever I've given a talk on these topics, the question whether plants have a final good inevitably comes up. A plant is certainly a functional unity, organized for survival and reproduction, so it plainly has at least a functional good. Although a plant doesn't have a view of the world, it's an agent in the minimal sense that it does things of its own accord, and sometimes does them in response to conditions in the environment. It sends out tendrils in response to spring weather, or turns towards the sun, or in dry soil reaches down further with its roots. But it's not, so far as we can tell anyway, guided by perception or attractive and aversive reactions. But here we run into a very large issue in the philosophy of mind. In fact, possibly the biggest issue in philosophy of mind, because it bears on the question whether consciousness really represents a hard problem. It's possible that the difference between the kind of responsiveness that a plant exhibits and what we call perception or representation is a matter of degree. The capacity to represent, that is to say, the mind in its theoretic aspect, may just be a hugely more nuanced version of the capacity to respond. This is an essentially anti-realist thought which may be more attractive to Kantians like myself than it is to some of you. But if that's so, rather than being an altogether different kind of thing, for purposes of this discussion, plants are on a scale with animals, although at the very lower end of it. They're on a scale of things that maintain themselves by responding to the conditions in the world around them. But precisely because a plant's kind of responsiveness does not quite seem to rise to the level of perception or representation, there is, as it were, not much distance between the sense in which a plant has a functional good and the sense in which it has a final good. Something similar seems to apply to the differences among animals. So far, I've been assuming that any percipient animal does have something like a view of the world, at least a way the animal experiences the world, something that it's like for the animal. And I've been assuming that any animal's way of experiencing the world is valenced, that it's guided by attractions and aversions. But one might believe of cognitively simple animals that their level of responsiveness is only a little bit more sophisticated and nuanced than a plant's. And one might certainly wonder to what extent it is valenced. So we might suppose that as we move down the cognitive scale, the distance between the fact that an animal has a functional good and the fact that the animal has a final good, in a way, decreases. The distance between those two things decreases. In that case, we might think that the extent to which a creature has a final good is a matter of degree. Now, as I said, I've not yet explained why I think final goods are morally important. But assuming they are, it seems to me possible that the degree to which a creature can be said to have a final good maps, if it does not precisely explain, a moral intuition which is shared by many of us, which is that the fate of more cognitively sophisticated animals is of greater moral concern than the fate of less cognitively sophisticated animals. Most of us think, for instance, that it's worse to needlessly hurt or kill a dog or a monkey than an insect. Of course, this might just be a prejudice born of a suspect relation between size and the arousal of squeamishness. But suppose there's something in it. We might think, to use some rather hand-wavy terms, that a more cognitively sophisticated animal has a final good in a sense that is in some way bigger or deeper or firmer along some yet to be specified dimension than a less cognitively sophisticated one does, and that all this matters morally. Alternatively, we may say that the less cognitively sophisticated animal has a final good in the same sense as the more sophisticated animal, but he has less of a stake in his own final good. Either way, to support this kind of intuition, we would have to be able to tell a plausible story about what sorts of cognitive differences factor into the decision about how much an animal's final good matters morally. It can't plausibly be thought that the difference that matters is simply one of intelligence, even if we suppose that there is such a thing. We certainly do not think that the fate of more intelligent people matters more than the fate of less intelligent ones. But we might instead suppose that the cognitive differences that determine to what extent it makes sense to say that an animal has a final good, or alternatively what kind of stake he has in his final good, are the ones that inform the extent to which it makes sense to think of the animal as having a self. Here's what I have in mind. When philosophers work on questions of personal identity, we identify certain factors as giving a person a certain kind of continuity over time and unity at a time, and so making the person one person, a person with a single self now and enduring. Episodic memory, ongoing relationships, even long-term projects are among those factors. Some of these factors may also be found in the lives of animals. An animal who remembers events, or who has particular friends, or who interacts with individuals as such, or who maintains family ties, or who is puzzled when things are different from usual, might be thought to have more of an ongoing self than an animal who does not do those things. And that would mean that the sense in which things are good or bad for that animal in particular is in a certain way a firmer one. Something can only be good or bad for you to the extent that there is a you, which is to say, to the extent that there's a unified you. That seems like something that might matter morally. This way of thinking has an interesting metaphysical implication. If your identity criteria are more lax, your good is accordingly more indefinite. A planarium, a flatworm, when cut in half, may turn into 2 planaria. For most of us, it is a very bad thing to be cut in half. Is it bad for the planarian? Well, bad for whom exactly? Which of the 3? We might suppose that if you have a psychological as well as a physical identity, then your identity criteria are stricter. You have to maintain psychological as well as physical continuity in order to remain yourself. According to the line of thought we're now exploring, that means you're more capable of having a final good, or alternatively, that you have a greater stake in your final good. But having a psychological identity also means that more things can be bad for you. You can suffer a kind of death from physical changes that induce massive psychological changes, even if those physical changes are insufficient to destroy your physical unity. That means that the things that most definitely have a final good, or the things that have the greatest stake in their final good, are in a certain way the most fragile things. They're the things that have to work hardest at self-constitution. Suppose now that if we do decide that having a final good matters morally, that this is what confers moral standing, as philosophers like to call it, on a creature. And suppose that we decide that having a final good is a matter of degree. Then the implication is that the criterion of moral standing implied by my account is not, as you might have thought up until now, sentience. It's the extent to which something can be said to have a self. Now, there's another reason why people are tempted to think that plants have a final good. As I argued above, a plant is at least a functional unity, and things can be good or bad for it in the functional sense. But from an Aristotelian point of view, it makes sense to argue that the way in which things can be functionally good or bad for plants is different from the way in which things can be functionally good or bad for machines. For the reason we regard a plant as a functional unity is that since it is an organism, it seems to have something like self-maintenance or self-constitution as its end. And this means that the things that are good or bad for a plant are good or bad for, as we say, the plant's own sake. This seems different from the case of a machine. What's good for the machine is good for its owner. When the rain makes the cotton grow, that's good for both the cotton plants and the farmer. But it's not good for the cotton plants only because it's good for the farmer. We can see this by considering the case where the rain makes the weeds grow, which is good for the weeds but not for the farmer. It's good for the weeds for their own sake. Now, you might think that the account I've just given of the way in which things are good for plants represents a rival to the story I've been telling in these lectures. I've claimed that what makes an entity capable of having a final good is that the entity is the kind of thing that takes care of itself through action. But now that we've introduced the idea of the sake, you might think instead that what makes something capable of having a final good is that things can be good for its own sake. And these two things, being a creature that takes care of its own functional good through action and having a sake, can apparently fall apart. Because if we suppose that plants are in no sense agents and don't have any final ends, then they don't have a final good in my sense, and yet it does seem clear that things can be good for their own sake. This doesn't worry me very much. I could counter the objection by arguing that, as I've already suggested, plants are in some very minimal sense agents. Or I could try to argue that because plants lack selves, or to the extent that they lack selves, things can't really be good for a plant's own sake, and we only talk that way because we analogize them to animals. But it looks as if there's one thing I cannot do. I cannot just dismiss the objection with the reply that having a functional good is sufficient for having a sake. For as I mentioned in setting up the objection, we seem to think that having a sake of your own makes a difference between plants and machines. Now, in my last lecture, I claimed that functional organization is sufficient to support the functional conception of good for. The properties that enable an entity to function well make it a good one, and the conditions that promote or support or realize those properties are good for it. We talk that way about machines. Riding the brakes or using impure gasoline is bad for your car. But while it's natural to think that though things can be good or bad in the functional sense, for, say, my vacuum cleaner, there's no reason to suppose that anything is good or bad for my vacuum cleaner's own sake. Rather, it seems more natural to say that the things that are good or bad for my vacuum cleaner are good or bad for me as the one doomed to wield that vacuum cleaner. If my vacuum cleaner is cleaning poorly because I haven't changed the dust bag recently, that's not really so much bad for the vacuum cleaner as it is bad for me. In fact, sometimes when we talk about what is good for a machine, it's fundamentally unclear whether we're really talking about something that enables it to perform its function or something that would give it other properties that we would like it to have. And this is because it's fundamentally unclear whether we should count as part of a machine's function its having all of the properties we would like it to have. A common example of what I have in mind is when we say that something is good for a machine, meaning that it will enable the machine to keep functioning and last for a long time. We usually prefer machines and other tools that last for a long time, and that makes us think about them rather as if they were organisms. For it is part of the function of a living thing to last, that is, to keep itself alive. But self-maintenance is not, or at least not obviously, part of the function of a machine or a tool. Rather tellingly, we even speak of a machine in these contexts as having a life. Using good gasoline, we say, will extend the life of your car. But does that make it better at performing its function, if that is to serve as a means of transport? We don't need to answer this question because the whole issue arises simply because the good of artifacts is just a projection of their goodness for us. So an organism does seem to have a good in a much deeper sense than an artifact does, which is why we say that it has its own sake. But if having a functional good is enough to support having a sake, why can't things be good for a machine's own sake? The explanation may be metaphysical. In self-constitution, I argue that machines and tools are actually incomplete substances. The idea is this: a substance, according to Aristotle, is fully actualized only when it actually performs its characteristic activity, the activity that makes it what it is, the activity in terms of which we define it. This is perfectly clear in the case of living things, which are either going about their characteristic self-constitutive activities. In the case of an animal, say, least respiration, digestion, the circulation of the blood, or they don't exist at all. In a certain way, organisms can only perform their characteristic activities when they're actually performing them, that is, when they're alive. Now, you might think that this marks a difference between living things and machines or other artifacts. A vacuum cleaner may sit unused in the closet or a car in the garage and exist even though it is not performing its characteristic activity. This is related to another apparent difference between living things and artifacts, which is that living things are made of parts that, strictly speaking, cannot exist independently of the living things themselves. I made this point about Aristotle and the hand yesterday. You can't build a giraffe out of the tender green leaves that grow at the top of mimosa trees, but a giraffe's nutritive processes turn those tender green leaves into the kinds of matter out of which a giraffe is built: giraffe tissues and giraffe organs and so forth. Indeed, it's because the living tissues that make up organisms are comparatively fragile and in need of constant renewal that if a giraffe ceases its activities, if it stops eating mimosa leaves or stops digesting them when it does, it will fall apart and die. This means that, strictly speaking, being a giraffe is not a state, but rather an activity. Being a giraffe is doing something. A giraffe is quite essentially an entity that's always making itself into a giraffe. So to be a giraffe is simply to engage in the activity of constantly making yourself into a giraffe. That's what a giraffe's life consists in. And that's why it must always be engaged in its definitive activity in order to be what it is at all. But actually, speaking very strictly, the point about parts is true of artifacts as well. Their parts can't exist independently of the artifacts themselves. This is because the parts themselves are functionally defined. They must be capable of performing their functions, and they cannot perform their functions unless they're part of the artifact. For example, large slabs of sheetrock or plaster can exist apart from houses, but walls can't, because walls are functionally defined, and a slab of plaster or sheetrock that is not part of a house cannot divide one room from another or help to hold up a roof. On Aristotle's account, a machine is defined in terms of its essential activity. It is the thing that can perform that activity. And it can't perform that activity unless it has functioning parts. But in fact, most machines cannot perform their activities all by themselves. They need to be wielded by a human being in some way, if only by being plugged in or turned on before they can perform their functions. They don't just go about their business the way that animals do. It isn't quite right, then, to say of the vacuum cleaner in your closet that it can clean floors, since actually, until you plug it in and wield it, it can't. What that means is that, strictly speaking, machines, or at least many of them, when they're just sitting around doing nothing on our shelves or in our closets, are incomplete entities. They only start to perform their function when some last part is plugged in or inserted. In fact, it looks as if the truth about this matter may be very depressing. There is no such artifact as a vacuum cleaner at all. Instead, what you call your vacuum cleaner is actually an entity that, when properly incorporated by you, makes you into a vacuum cleaner. On this reading, what we ordinarily call a vacuum cleaner is not a functional unity at all, and so it doesn't really have a good. And that explains why what we call its good is really for your sake rather than its own. Furthermore, on this reading, the way in which the vacuum cleaner's poor performance is bad for you is not, or not merely, that it's instrumentally bad because your end is to get the floor clean and you can't. Rather, the way in which the vacuum cleaner's poor performance is bad for you is that it is interfering with your attempts to constitute yourself as a vacuum cleaner. Odd as it may sound, when we think of it this way, it looks as if the vacuum cleaner's poor performance is bad for you in the final sense. That's why when the tools we try to use aren't working, what we experience is frustration and not merely disappointment that the ends we hoped for have not been achieved. Now, keep in mind that the question we've just been examining is different from another question we might think about. This actually came up in, I think, yesterday's discussion. That's the question whether we could build a machine that does engage in the activities of self-constitution. Since I am, as I explained in my first lecture, a philosophical naturalist, of course I think that's possible, because that's what nature did when she built plants and animals. There's no reason to suppose we might not do it too. But that's not what the machines we actually use are like. Machines, rather, are just equipment in the literal sense. They are ways we equip ourselves for the performance of certain tasks. So the reasons why things aren't good for the machine's own sake is that the machine is not actually a functional unity after all. And that means that functional unity is sufficient to support the notion of the sake. Now, you might think that this conclusion is challenged by the possible existence of completely robotic devices. They make robotic vacuum cleaners now, although they still have to be turned on. Imagine we invent a vacuum cleaner with a very long-lasting battery. Once we insert the battery, it's off and running, never to stop until something kills it, maybe something other than the battery running out. Are the properties that make it function good for its own sake or for ours? Well, presumably, if the thing is to be any good, among the properties we will give it are some sorts of sensors that will discourage it from doing the things that will kill it, like crashing into brick walls or falling off of ledges. In that case, we might be perfectly happy to say that being good at its function is good for the vacuum cleaner's own sake. So we can still say that functional good is sufficient to support the idea of having one's own sake. Whether the robotic vacuum cleaner has a final good will then depend on whether the work of the sensors is sufficiently refined and nuanced to amount to perception. Now, those conclusions make it easier for me to say what I have to say about the environment. Does the environment have a good? Can things be good or bad for the environment, either in the final or the functional sense? At the risk of initially shocking some liberal sensibilities, I think that the answer is plainly no. Nothing we can do is bad for the environment. This is not, however, the good news it appears to be. The problem is that the environment doesn't have a function and therefore cannot function well or badly. It seems to us to have a function, first of all, because we are biased in favor of life, and second, because we're biased in favor of our own kind of life, and third, because we're biased in favor of the other kinds of life that we particularly like. To us, it seems important that the environment should support life, in particular that it should support human life, and also that it should support the singing birds and the beautiful furry animals and the magnificent breaching whales that we like to have around us. But it's not the function of the environment to support human beings and the kinds of life that we like. This is just an extraneous purpose that we happen to have for it. The environment would be doing just as good a job at being an environment if the world were a desert full of scorpions and snakes, for it would be as good as it needs to be for scorpions and snakes, and they would be the only ones around to whom it could possibly matter. That's the trouble with the environment. It's always good enough for the population it serves. Now, you may wish to argue that the environment is surely a homeostatic system. Aren't we always talking about the balance of nature and the things that we do to upset it? But there's the same problem again. In the long run, we might say that nature's balance is a little too good. She may cease to support the kind of ecosystem she's supporting now, but she'll right herself somehow and achieve some new equilibrium. She won't die. Or we might say that in the even longer run, she will never achieve equilibrium and so can't count as a homeostatic system, or anyway, not one that's favorable to life. The idea that nature achieves a balance is just a delusion born of short-term thinking. Either way, nothing we can do can be bad for nature. But as I say, this is not good news. For the environment we live in is chock full of actual living creatures, almost made of actual living creatures, all of them dependent on the environment staying roughly the way it is now, or the way it was a little while ago. In fact, the environment is made of living creatures, most of them animals, who have final goods and who are dependent upon plants. And anything we do that changes how the environment works in serious ways is opposed to the final good of nearly all those creatures. So we don't need to say romantic things about the environment having a good of its own in order to be seriously concerned about what we're doing to the environment. We just need a due concern for ourselves and the many other living creatures for whom the environment is home. Another thing you often hear people say is that something is good or bad for a species. Does a species have a good? You also sometimes hear people say that something that's good for a species is good for the members of the species. We might be tempted to say that a species has a functional good because it seems designed to keep itself going in something like the same way that an individual animal is. I think there might be problems about that. But let's say that a species does have a functional good and that it is its own survival. Still, a species is not as an agent and it doesn't have a final good. I think people are tempted to think that a species has something like a final good indirectly in virtue of the final good of its members. That's why they describe the things that are good for the species as being good for the animals themselves. They describe something that's good for the survival of the species elephant as being good for elephants, for instance. Now, in some cases, it's obviously true that the things that are good for the animals are therefore good for the species. It's good for the elephants themselves to have a place to live and enough food and water and favorable breeding conditions. And because it is good for the elephants themselves, it's also good for the species elephant. But the inference doesn't go the other way, from what's good for the species to what is good for the animals themselves. It might be good for the survival of the species if the population is culled, but that's not good for the elephants who get culled. There's an important difference between human beings and the other animals in this regard that I think is often neglected. Feuerbach and Marx pointed it out when they said that human beings are the only species who think of themselves as members of a species. We each of us have a stake in the continued existence of our species. We think of our lives, as McNann suggested, in narrative terms, and we often fit our personal narratives into the narratives of the species, into the human story. Many of our own projects would make no sense if we were not to be followed by many other generations of human beings. We would not have the same kinds of reasons to cure diseases and write books and make scientific discoveries and eradicate political evils and have children if we expected the human species to go extinct in the near future. We have personal reasons to care whether humanity survives. Many of us would be prepared to face an early death if for some odd reason the survival of the species required it. And I don't think this has to be considered a matter of pure altruism. Our own lives would make very little sense if we cut ourselves off from the rest of humanity. So it's odd to say this, given that reproduction is pretty much the main business of non-rational animal life. But I don't think that animals have a good reason to, as it were, care about the survival of their own species. It's not part of their good. Their stance towards reproduction itself is frankly competitive with other members of their species. We might, I suppose, think of them as having something like a reason to care about the survival of their own group or family. Their own lives make as much sense to them as they can make without any conception of the future of their species. They're not like us in this regard. So if the good of species does matter, it's not because it matters to individuals in the species directly. But of course, the existence of a species can be essential to maintaining the current so-called balance of nature, and the current balance of nature is essential, as I've said, to the animals themselves. If we try to preserve species, I think it should be for the sake of the environment, and if we try to preserve the environment, it should be for the sake of the animals themselves, the ones who depend on it now and will do so in the near future. Of course, we may also try to preserve species that for one reason or another we especially like. But that would be for our sake, not for theirs. It's not, in my view, a plausible moral end to attend to the good of the species just because it is a good, if indeed it is one. Now this brings me to our last special case, the human good. And of course, what I say about here isn't going to be adequate to the story because this is a big question. I've claimed that the primary case of something that has a good is an animal, and I believe that it's the fact that we're animals that makes it the case that we have a good. But you might think we must have a good in some different sense than the other animals do. For after all, it will not have escaped your attention that what counts as a good for an animal, on my view, is basically for the animal to lead a healthy life of the animal's kind. Am I claiming that the long-sought answer to the old question, what is the human good, is that it's simply to lead a healthy life of our kind? To survive and reproduce in the characteristically human way? That answer, you may worry, seems disappointingly thin. But I'm not claiming that, or rather, in a way I am. It's just that this is not a thin and disappointing answer when we think about what's involved in the specifically human mode of survival and reproduction, and in leading a healthy life of our kind. Last time I mentioned that in his book on the soul, Aristotle asserts that there are three forms of life corresponding to what he thought of as the three parts of the soul. At the bottom is a life of basic self-maintenance, a vegetative life of nutrition and reproduction, common to all plants and animals. Animals are distinguished from plants in being alive in a further sense, given, as we've seen, by the powers of perception and action. The third form of life described by Aristotle is distinctive of human beings, the life of rational activity, the life of choice. Aristotle thinks that the addition of each new part of the soul changes the sense in which the thing lives, both by influencing the way the lower functions are carried out and by adding new kinds of activities and so new forms of life, and along with those, by adding new forms of identity. Because she has the powers that make agency possible, an animal lives in a sense that a plant doesn't. An animal's conscious, She's active in the sense that she does things. She pursues what she desires and flees what she fears. She builds a home and raises a family. If she's a higher animal, she may even know how to love and how to play. And because she engages in these activities, she has a different form of identity than a plant. Because an animal is a someone. To some extent, she has a self, and a plant is not. Now, according to Aristotle, a human being, a rational being, in turn has a life and an identity in a sense in which a non-human animal does not. Because a non-human animal's life is mapped out for him by his instincts. And any two members of a given species basically lead the same sort of life, unless the differences are biologically fixed, as by age and gender, or by kind, such among bees. Human being has a life in a different sense than this, for a human being has and is capable of choosing what we sometimes call a way of life, or following Rawls' your own conception of the good. So rationality introduces a whole new sense of life, a new sense in which a person can be said to have a life. It also introduces new activities that the other animals don't engage in, like science and the arts and philosophy and organized singing and dancing and sports. And with this new form of life comes a new form of identity. A full story about these matters would involve describing why rationality makes these things our ways of carrying out certain functions. Now, elsewhere, I've tried to explain what this specifically human form of identity is. I call it practical identity, and I've defined it in terms of the roles and relationships in which we value ourselves and find our lives worth living and our actions worth undertaking. The human function involves choosing our own conceptions of the good and constructing our own practical identities. So for us, the functional sense of good for, and the final sense too, will include whatever promotes and constitutes our practical identities. This makes two very important differences to the character of the human good. First, the fact that the human good involves adopting and maintaining our own conception of the good and our own practical identities introduces some obvious complications in the account of the human good. The fact that we have practical identities means that a human being, in order to achieve the final good for herself, has to live a life in which she functions well on two levels. She has to function well in the roles and relationships and occupations with which she has chosen to identify herself, and she has to function well as a human being, as a human animal. And although functioning well in the roles and identities she has chosen for herself is certainly part of what goes into her functioning well as a human being, I'm supposing that it's not all, that we have needs and interests that arise from our general human nature and not just from the particular nature that we've carved out for ourselves. So the human being in effect the human good in effect has two parts: to function well in whatever practical identities you've chosen for yourself, and to function well as a human being, including having practical identities that enable you, as far as possible, to function well as a human being. I believe that some of the special complexity of the questions we run into when we try to think about the human good comes from the fact that these different elements of the human good can pull apart. For instance, you might be driven through the very success of some project that you've identified yourself with to take up an obsessive form of life. An accomplished artist or a scientist might function brilliantly and find thorough satisfaction in a life in which many of her other human capacities are atrophied from lack of use. Maybe she has few friends and no family, and has enjoyed very little of humanity's achievements outside of her own beloved field. Could this be a good human life? The idea of the human good doesn't obviously dictate some specific balance between your needs just as a human being and your needs as the person you've chosen to be. The human good is a complex matter because we have a dual identity. We're human beings and we're the particular human beings who we are. But the two parts of the human good also work together because it's one of the most essential points about practical identity that it's a normative form of identity. A practical identity is a conception under which you value yourself. Practical identity gives human life a distinctively normative dimension. Your practical identities set requirements and standards for you, and you judge yourself to be good or bad, a success or a failure as a person, when you think about how well or badly you meet those standards. Human life is a form of life governed by values and moral standards. And the lives of other animals are not like this. Human life requires thinking well of yourself and thinking that your life is worthwhile and not just good for you. In fact, given that what's distinctive of human life is that we engage in a normative form of self-constitution, it seems clear what the human good is. The human good is to make something worthwhile of yourself. Now, I know that this sounds paradoxical. How can I define the human final good in terms of values in the middle of a story about how values come to exist at all? Where are we to get the values in terms of which we judge our lives and ourselves to be good or bad? The answer is that this is where the other part of the human good comes in, the part that has to do with living the life of our kind. Although it would take some arguments to explain exactly why, the human way of functioning involves engaging in the arts and sciences, and organized singing and dancing and sports, and of course doing philosophy. It involves loving and living in families and towns and nations and taking up causes. And it involves morality. These are not just things that we do, but ways that we do things, if not always as individuals, as a species. They're essential to the way that we function. That's the source of the values in terms of which we judge our individual lives to be worthwhile or not. So there need be no paradox, in spite of the sound of one. The human good is to make yourself and your life into something worthwhile. And in this, I believe, we are unlike any other animal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a most interesting talk. I would be interested to hear what you say about how you understand the word sake when you talk about. I've been thinking about that a bit myself, and I've realized that it's sort of a divide in languages when it comes to how to understand this notion. So many languages, many Latin languages, for instance, tend to translate this in terms of a sort of evaluative notion. So doing something for someone's sake would be doing it for this person's good, simply. While many Germanic languages tend to use a non-evaluative use. So we talk about sake, like in which, for instance, etymologically, I think goes back to, in Swedish, for instance, it goes back to cause, orsak. That's the sort of roots we have for this sort of notion. So my question to you is when you talk about the final good, and you understand it in terms of sake, what are you having in mind here? Is it a sort of evaluative notion, or is it a non-evaluative? If it's a non-evaluative, could you please say something more about what you mean by sake here?
It would certainly have to be a non-evaluative notion for my argument to go through. If it's an evaluative notion, then I have to introduce the good sooner than I do. And I don't know exactly what to say about what it means. There is a particular thing that is the functional system in question. And I was taking it, that was the point of this weird argument about machines, that you have a sake if your functional good, if you're the thing whose functional good is in question and you're functioning well. The things that make the thing function well are good for its own sake, just in the sense that they're good for it, the thing itself. So it's the target of its own well-functioning, so to speak. And that's why I had to get rid of the case of machines, or it looks like I have to get rid of it, because the target of their own well-functioning is clearly not them, but getting a job done.
Okay, so I have two rather short questions on the functional good. And the first is probably just about a misunderstanding on my part, because I got the sense that you said that artifacts like knives could have a functional good. But it seems that the argument against machines having a functional good would work.
Yeah, and in the end, this would have to be extended to artifacts and well.
Because,
again,
I mean,
the knife can't cut. What
No,
can cut is
precisely.
you with a knife
Yes.
in your hand.
I can
so the
become a
knife is
knife-
just equipment that makes
I
you
can
into
become a cutter with
yeah.
a knife, but
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And the other one concerns the environment. I mean, you talk about the environment in the abstract, but one might also talk about ecosystems and particular ecosystems. And there, although, I mean, the identity conditions for ecosystems are, I guess, bound to be complex and vague. But still, one might say that we might kill off a particular ecosystem, or we might destroy a particular ecosystem. It will be replaced by some other form of nature, but that particular ecosystem might be forever gone. So perhaps with respect to ecosystems, one might then say that they could have something like a functional good.
Right. I think they could have a functional good. Ecosystems obviously are not sentient, not by themselves. So I think they couldn't have a final good. So I'm still going to say it matters morally, only because the ecosystem matters to the animals that constitute it, and the plants matter to the animals. So it's all, in the end, if it matters morally, it's only because it matters to the animals. But yeah, I agree with you, it might have a functional good.
The suggestion that you make is that final good has very much to do with the functional sense of good, but also with having one's own perspective on that. So it's not enough to have a functional good, but there has to be the perspective of the entity, right? And I find it very reasonable as a position, but I would say that one way of looking at it is that this is a genealogy of the concept, that this is where our concept of a final good for a person or for an entity comes from. But that doesn't mean that the only thing that can be finally good for a person is well-functioning of that person, either in physical terms or in terms of practical identity. There could be other things to go for. So it's, even though it starts precisely as you say, it starts with this thing with functional good for the entity and the perspective, right? But then this notion can take in other objects, and then it could be a final good for me that, let's say, poor people in India have a better life. Well, this has nothing to do with my functional, my well-functioning. So my goal is not to be a better functioning helper, right? It's rather my goal is that those people are being helped.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that our goal is our own well-functioning. I'm saying that our values spring from. So it is a genealogical notion. I don't think, though, that the final good tears away completely. I mean, I think the genealogical story still affects the story about value. Maybe this analogy would help. I was talking about the analogy with health yesterday and the way that Plato and Aristotle always compared health to virtue. If you are in a healthy condition, you enjoy physical activity. And it's true that physical activity helps to keep you in a healthy condition. But it's not true that the only reason you care about physical activity is that it helps you to keep you in. It's an expression of your good condition that you enjoy it. I think that's how it is with us and the people in India. It's an expression of your being in good shape as a human being if you care about things like that.
But those things are things to go for, right? So those things are final good for a person like me.
Well, all of these things, there's the maintenance of being in the good condition is still supposed to be involved there.
So in the sense that, well, insofar
But that's
as
not why you go for them. But it
That's
keeps
not-
you in good shape as a human being also.
But they are my final good because they maintain my condition as a person.
No, they're your final good because they're what you find it worth going for.
Yes, what I find worth going for. So certain things that are worth going for has nothing to do with my function, well functioning.
Your well-functioning explains what you find worth going for.
Right, but things, I have certain goals which I find worthwhile going for. And some of those goals have nothing to do with my well-functioning. So certain things constitute my final good, despite the fact that they have nothing to do, that they contribute they do not contribute to my function.
They contribute to your well-functioning in the sense, and it would have to be spelled out in detail. I'm not saying I'm giving an argument here, just a structure of the argument, in the sense that if you did not continue to care about those things, you would be in bad shape as a human being. And let me give you an analogy. This analogy may put people off as much as it wins them, but in the Republic, Plato spells out what it is to be just, completely in terms of the interaction, the interrelations among the parts of your soul. And then at a certain point, somebody says, one of the interlocutors says, Socrates says, does this account meet sort of the test of the usual examples? And these usual examples are doing all good moral things like keeping your promises and your contracts, and for Plato, respecting your mother and father and not robbing temples. And everybody says, yes, it does. Somebody who was in this kind of shape would not do those things. So it's that kind of structure where because you're in a certain kind of good condition, you value certain things. But it is also supposed to have the implication that if you didn't value those things, you would yourself stop. But I'm not saying this is your purpose. I'm just saying this explains what's going on.
I just have a question. You say about the concept of integration and continued existence and how it fits in with what you say about the human good. Because one way of understanding what you say about why animals are more important, why there are degrees of final goods, is that the degree of integration explains the degree in which you have a final good and the degree in which you have a moral status. But then how do you, is it that concept of integration that plays a role also when you talk about the human good? For one way of understanding what you say about the human good is that you say that it is to have your own conception of the good. It may some sense more. You are more integrated. You reflect about your values and so on. And then you also have the idea that living the kind of life as a human is important. But you have to, and then I ask myself, if you should explain why making the kind of good that humans have more important, more morally important, is it in terms of integration?
I didn't claim that the human good is more morally important. I did give some arguments that you could use to draw that conclusion.
But could you say something like that?
I think you could see. It's a complicated issue for this reason. What I claimed was that your good might be more morally important to the extent that you could be said to have a self. But then I also claimed that human beings have a self in an additional sense. Now, whether that makes them more integrated or not is not really sort of immediately clear to me. But the riff at the end about the different kinds of identity, human beings have particular selves in the sense of having these normative forms of identity, that make our lives seem to us to be successes and failures, worthwhile or not worthwhile. It is true that when I said the thing earlier about the relation between integration and fragility, I had the kind of argument that you're talking about now in mind. I do think it's the case that the additional complexity of human life makes integrating yourself harder work. And maybe that means you're more integrated when you do achieve it. I mean, I think, you know, a certain kind of very primitive animal like a worm probably can only die a physical death. Some animal with a psychology could die a psychological death if something happened to it that made it very different, maybe deprived of its memories or something like that. Human beings can also die a moral death. So there is this additional fragility, which means that working at integrating ourselves is much harder because we have to keep ourselves alive in many more ways.
Yeah, thank you. My question concerns the question for understanding, to understand the last part of your talk and the definition of human morality and the definition of good and bad. It seems that, if I understand properly, okay, morality and good and bad for us is defined both in terms of individual self-representation and within a context of the humankind. Okay, there are those two components. My question is that, are you intending with that there is that we might be able to define good and bad only with respect to those two terms, or do you leave space to the idea that maybe we should define, you know, morality and good and bad with respect, for example, also environment? I make a crude example, okay? Being a scientist or an academic is valuable, okay, and atrophizing other human capacity is valuable for an individual in a given society for certain evolutionary reason, namely the fact that we live in an since 10,000 years more or less in an agricultural society in which it's good to the society for external reasons has been structured in a certain way with division of labor. This doesn't happen in a society of hunters, for example, where, you know. So, yeah, my question is more or less that, to make it brief. So, can we define morality, according to you, only with respect to what is the position of the individual with respect to humankind, or should something else taken into account?
I actually haven't really said anything yet about how I think of morality. I mentioned it as it's being one of the features of the way we function, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow. I do think that the array of practical identities available for you to take up is different in different societies, and therefore the way you can conceive yourself as part of the ongoing life of humanity is different in different societies. So there would be that kind of difference. I think of morality as governing those practical identities in the same way, but I haven't said anything about that in these lectures. I've discussed that elsewhere. So I don't know whether I'm responding to your question or not, because I'm not sure I'm getting it.
Okay, it was more a question for understanding where you were heading to, or what was the point. And, but yeah, I can leave it space to others.
Okay, so I think this might be related to Vlorek's question about this genealogical account. I mean, in some circles, genealogical account, like sort of Nietzschean or Foucauldian genealogical, is supposed to be sort of undermining of that which it is an account of, and that might be a danger even if that's not what you're aiming for. So I mean, for instance, with this account, I mean, is it an account of the final good for us, or an account of why certain things appear to be finally good for us?
It's an account of the final good for us.
Yes, and why is it an account not just of why certain things appear to be finally good for us?
Because it's an account according to which all value depends on valuing, rather than the reverse. And it's an account that suggests not only how valuing gets done, but how valuing might get done well or badly.
Okay, so the kind of valuing that we do when we function well, then that's real final value, and the kind of valuing we do, but valuing seems to be we do what we do what we do when we function well. So I mean, is it possible to function well and value I don't know, sort of torture and
No, I'm saying no, it's not possible. But I would have to, that would be based on spelling out the details of how it is that morality is involved in our well-functioning.
Okay,
And-
so it's sort of
that it's immoral.
when this kind of projection is done well, then that's real final value, and when it's done badly, then it's not.
I mean, I think this is just, with any sort of non-realist account of values, there's always this temptation to say, but is it really so when the account is over?
Yeah.
I would like you to say some more words about the distinction between machines and plants on the background of the fact that you, on the one hand, are taking Aristotle as plain Aristotle, and he had a static view of the world, whereas in some of the parts of your talk, you explicitly subscribe to evolutionary biology. And now comes my question. Let's accept evolutionary biology. Then you seemed to suggest that human beings might one day create, so to speak, it's more than a machine. Chemists and physicists out of pure dead matter may create something that we spontaneously call a plant. Would it then, according to you, be a plant? And even more, perhaps one day, in the distant future, physicists and chemists might, out of dead matter, create something that we spontaneously would call an animal, that is, an entity that, in your phrase, whose function is to take care of its own well-functioning. So you realize how I see at evolutionary biology. There are continuities. There is a continuity between plants and animals and human beings. And a lot of philosophers nowadays speak of transhumanity, and yeah, I guess you heard of it. And it must be a kind of logical possibility. But my two questions is, how do you, if you accept that human beings might create something that we spontaneously call a plant, second, spontaneously call an animal, what about their final goods?
I say that if we created something that looked after its own well-functioning, and in doing so was guided by responses sufficiently nuanced to count as perception, and that's taking certain thesis in the philosophy of mind that is a matter of degree there, then the thing would have a final good.
And the answer is, or in both cases, simply yes, they have fun. The kind of entities I wanted you to envision, yes, if they come into being, then they have a final good.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. Good or bad, I don't know, but I understand what you are saying.